January 20, 1942, in the humid, salt-sprayed waters of Darwin, Australia, the morning sun climbed into a sky that no longer belonged to the Allies. At 11 a.m., a series of muffled explosions rocked the seabed as the Japanese submarine I-124 was sent to the bottom by Australian corvettes. To the surface world, this was a minor naval skirmish in a theater defined by massive losses. But beneath the waves, inside that shattered hull, lay a prize more valuable than any carrier. The current codebooks for the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational cipher, known to the Americans as JN-25. This event was a quiet turning point in a war that, until then, seemed destined for a total Japanese victory. Following the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Theater had become a vast, terrifying chessboard where the United States was playing with half its pieces missing. The Imperial Japanese Navy was an unstoppable juggernaut, slicing through Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies with terrifying precision. By early 1942, the strategic situation was a grim deadlock for the Americans. They were forced into a defensive crouch, reacting to shadows, never quite sure where the next blow would fall. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor strike, was already planning his next move to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a final, decisive battle. He believed in the superiority of his sailors and the invincibility of his ships. What he did not account for was the silent war being fought in a windowless basement in Hawaii. The Japanese relied on JN-25, a code so complex they believed it was mathematically unbreakable. It was not just a simple substitution of letters. It was a polyalphabetic system involving 30,000 five-digit groups, which were then further obscured by a secondary layer of random additive numbers from a separate table. To an outsider, an intercepted message looked like a chaotic wall of meaningless digits. It was a linguistic fortress designed to protect the most sensitive secrets of the empire. The Japanese admirals operated with a sense of absolute security, convinced that their commands moved through the airwaves like ghosts, invisible and untouchable. They assumed that even if the Americans intercepted the radio waves, the contents would remain an impenetrable mystery. But at Station Hippo in Pearl Harbor, a group of eccentric geniuses, musicians, and mathematicians led by Commander Joseph Rochefort were beginning to see patterns in the noise. Working in shifts that blurred day into night, they lived on coffee and cigarettes, rarely leaving their underground bunker known as the dungeon. By 2 p.m. on any given afternoon, the air in the basement was thick with smoke and the frantic clicking of IBM tabulating machines. They were not just breaking a code. They were learning the personality of the Japanese Navy. They learned how specific officers greeted one another, how they reported weather conditions, and how they requested fuel. Bit by bit, through sheer persistence and mathematical intuition, they began to strip away the additives, revealing the underlying code groups. This was a war of nerves. The Americans were hearing whispers of a massive operation, a destination referred to only by a two-letter designator. The Japanese were confident, their messages flowing with an arrogance born of repeated success. They had no idea that their most private strategic discussions were being transcribed and analyzed thousands of miles away. The deadlock of early 1942 was not just a matter of ships and planes, but of perception. Yamamoto saw a path to victory through the destruction of the American spirit. The Americans saw a path to survival through the mastery of the Japanese mind. This silent struggle represents one of the greatest intellectual feats in the history of warfare. It reminds us that the most decisive battles are often won long before the first shot is fired, in the quiet spaces where logic and intuition meet. The shock that would eventually overcome the Japanese high command was not just a reaction to a military defeat, but a realization that their entire worldview had been compromised. They had trusted in the silence of their codes, failing to realize that in the modern age, information is the only true armor, The legacy of JN-25 is a testament to the fact that while steel can be forged and ships can be built, the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is the ability to listen when your enemy thinks you are deaf. It was the beginning of for the Imperial Dream, whispered in the static of the Pacific air, May 1942, in the windowless basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor. A small group of men labored in a space they called the dungeon. This was Station Hypo, and at its center was Commander Joseph Rochefort, a man who wore a red smoking jacket and felt slippers to combat the damp chill of the underground air. He had not slept properly in days, his eyes bloodshot from staring at less rows of 5-digit groups that made up the Japanese naval code, JN-25. While the world looked toward the horizon for the next plume of smoke from an enemy fleet, Rochefort was looking for a ghost. The Japanese were planning something massive, an operation they referred to only as AF. In Washington, the senior intelligence officers were convinced that AF meant the Aleutian Islands, or perhaps even a direct strike on the California coast. But Rochefort, fueled by intuition and an intimate knowledge of Japanese syntax, felt in his bones that the target was Midway Atoll. He knew that if he was wrong, the remaining American carriers would be lured away, leaving the Hawaiian Islands defenseless. The pressure was suffocating. Yet Rochefort remained anchored by the conviction that numbers do not lie if you know how to speak their language. By 10 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the tension between Hawaii and the capital had reached a breaking point. Admiral Nimitz needed certainty, not theories. To bridge the gap between Rochefort's gut feeling and the hard proof Washington demanded, a young officer named Jasper Holmes proposed a daring bit of deception. He suggested they use the one thing the Japanese could not resist, a logistical vulnerability. They decided to a fake message in the clear, which they knew the Japanese would intercept. The command at Midway was instructed to broadcast an unencrypted radio message stating that their freshwater distillation plant had suffered a major breakdown. It was a simple, mundane problem, the kind of domestic headache that plagued any isolated outpost. They sent the message and then they waited. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the entire Pacific War. 2 days later, at 11:15 a.m., the breakthrough finally arrived. The listeners at Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese transmission that sent a jolt of electricity through the humid air of the basement. The message reported to the Imperial General Staff that AF was running low on fresh water and that the invasion force should plan to bring their own supplies. Rochefort had his smoking gun. The puzzle was complete, and the mask had been stripped away from the Japanese offensive. This was not just a tactical victory. It was a psychological dismantling of the Imperial Navy's primary advantage. They believed their codes were unbreakable, a divine shield that protected their movements from the prying eyes of the Westerners they viewed as inferior. In reality, their every secret was being whispered directly into the ears of Joseph Rochefort. Armed with this intelligence, Nimitz could ignore the feints toward the north and concentrate his dwindling resources exactly where the blow would fall. The trap was no longer being set for the Americans. It was being set for the Japanese. This moment, born in a basement filled with the hum of primitive computers and the scratch of pencils on paper, changed the course of the 20th century. It demonstrated that in the theater of total war, the most decisive terrain is often the human mind. The victory at Midway began not with the roar of dive bombers, but with the quiet scratching of a pen and a fake report about a water pump. The legacy of Station Hypo is a reminder that the loudest explosions are often preceded by the quietest insights. Rochefort and his team lived in a world of shadows, where their greatest triumphs could never be celebrated in public and their names remained classified for decades. They understood a fundamental truth of the modern age, that dominance is not merely a matter of who possesses the most steel, but who possesses the most truth. The breaking of the Japanese code was the ultimate act of intellectual defiance, proving that no wall is too high and no cipher too complex for the persistent human spirit. It serves as a poignant testament to the anonymous heroes who fought with logic instead of lead. As the sun set over the Pacific, the Imperial Navy sailed toward a horizon they thought was clear, unaware that their fate had already been written in the ink of a man who refused to believe in the word impossible. The true power of intelligence lies not in knowing what the enemy is doing, but in knowing why they think they are safe. It was this hidden clarity that ultimately turned the tide, transforming a desperate defense into the first steps toward a final, inevitable victory. May 14, 1942, inside the stifling, windowless basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood before a map that seemed to pulse with the threat of total annihilation. The man across from him, Commander Joseph Rochefort, was wearing a smoking jacket and slippers, his eyes bloodshot from days of sleepless decryption. He held a slip of paper that would change the course of human history. The message was clear in its intent but murky in its origin. The Japanese were planning a massive strike on a target labeled AF. Washington was convinced AF was the Aleutians, or perhaps the west coast of the United States. But Nimitz's gut, fed by Rochefort's relentless logic, whispered a different name. Midway, the gamble Nimitz was about to take was not merely tactical. It was an act of supreme faith in a science that many of his contemporaries viewed as little more than parlor tricks. In the high-stakes game of naval warfare, intelligence was often treated as a secondary tool, a supplement to the roar of the guns and the eyes of the scouts. But Nimitz realized that the traditional rules of engagement were dead. To save the Pacific, he had to trust the ghosts in the machine. He authorized a ruse that would echo through the decades of military deception. A plain text message was sent from Midway stating that their water distillation plant had broken down. When Japanese intercepts began buzzing with reports that AF was short on water, the trap was set. By 8 a.m. on May 15, the fog of war had partially lifted for Nimitz, but the physical reality of his situation remained grim. He had only two fully functional carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. The Yorktown was a blackened, limping wreck, scarred from the Battle of the Coral Sea. Conventional wisdom dictated she would need months in dry dock. Nimitz gave his engineers 72 hours. He walked the decks as over 1,000 men swarmed the ship, the smell of welding torches filling the air as they performed a miracle of steel and sweat. By the time the sun rose at 6 a.m. on May 30, the Yorktown was steaming out of the harbor, her flight deck patched and her spirit reborn. This was the moment of no return. Nimitz was committing every scrap of American carrier strength to a single point in the vastness of the Pacific based on nothing more than intercepted whispers. If Rochefort was wrong, or if the Japanese changed their plans at the last second, the American fleet would be out of position, leaving Hawaii and the American mainland defenseless. It was a burden of command that few men could shoulder without breaking. Yet Nimitz moved with a calm that unsettled his staff. He knew that the Imperial Japanese Navy, led by Admiral Yamamoto, was sailing with overwhelming numbers, 4 heavy carriers against his 3. Yamamoto believed he was the hunter, sailing into a vacuum where he would find no resistance. He did not know that his movements were being tracked like a heartbeat. The silence that followed the departure of the American task forces was the most agonizing period of Nimitz's career. As the ships moved toward their ambush positions northeast of Midway, the world seemed to hold its breath. Intelligence had provided the map, but it could not provide the victory. That would fall to the young pilots and the deck crews who would soon face the full might of the Kido Butai. Nimitz had done something unprecedented in the history of naval command. He had surrendered the safety of his remaining fleet to the invisible hands of the codebreakers, choosing to fight a battle of the mind before a single shot was fired. Looking back, the legacy of this decision remains one of the most profound lessons of the Second World War. It reminds us that victory is rarely the result of sheer force alone, but rather the intersection of preparation and the courage to trust what cannot be seen. Nimitz did not just move ships, he moved the very foundation of how wars are won. He understood that in the modern age, information was as lethal as any torpedo. The gamble at Midway was the ultimate testament to the human spirit's ability to find clarity amidst chaos. It was a moment where the weight of a nation's survival rested on the narrow shoulders of logic and the unwavering resolve of a commander who dared to believe in the impossible. This quiet brilliance, hidden in the shadows of code and shadow, became the beacon that led a fractured world back toward the light of peace. The greatest victories are often those that are won in the silence of the mind, long before the first shell hits the water. June 4, 1942, aboard the Imperial Japanese flagship Akagi. The morning air was thick with the scent of aviation fuel and the silent confidence of an empire that believed itself invincible. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge, watching the first wave of planes roar off the deck at 4:30 a.m. into the dim light of the eastern horizon. For months, the Kido Butai had rampaged across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, striking with a precision that seemed almost divine. To Nagumo and his staff, the mission was straightforward: neutralize the American outpost at Midway and lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where they would be systematically destroyed. They believed the Americans were demoralized, scattered, and, most importantly, completely unaware of the trap being laid for them. But as the sun climbed higher, the air of certainty began to crack. At 7:28 a.m., a scout plane from the cruiser Tone sent a frantic, garbled message that sent a jolt of electricity through the Japanese command. 10 ships, apparently enemy, had been sighted. For Nagumo, the report was a mathematical impossibility. According to Japanese intelligence, the American carriers were still weeks away from being combat-ready after the Battle of the Coral Sea, or they were lurking far to the south near Hawaii. Yet here they were, positioned precisely where they could threaten the Japanese flank. The Japanese admirals were not just facing a tactical threat, they were facing a reality that defied their strategic worldview. On the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, chaos replaced the disciplined efficiency of the morning. Orders were barked and then countermanded. Torpedoes were swapped for land attack bombs, and then swapped back again as the presence of American carriers was finally confirmed. Sailors worked with frantic desperation, leaving highly explosive ordnance and fuel hoses scattered across the hangars. At 10:20 a.m., the Japanese were minutes away from launching a counterstrike that might have edged the war in their favor. The flight decks were packed with fueled and armed aircraft, engines warming up, a lethal powder keg waiting for a single spark. That spark arrived not from the horizon, but from the heavens. At 10:22 a.m., 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, emerged from the clouds. They had found the Japanese fleet not by luck, but because Admiral Nimitz had known exactly where to use them. The Japanese lookouts, blinded by the glare of the morning sun and focused on the low-level torpedo bombers they had just chased away, saw the threat too late. Within 4 minutes, the pride of the Imperial Navy was a charnel house of twisted steel and roaring infernos. The shock that rippled through the Japanese high command in those moments was more than just the pain of tactical defeat. It was the crushing realization that their most sacred secrets had been laid bare. As the Akagi burned, Admiral Nagumo and his staff were forced to confront a terrifying truth. The Americans had not stumbled upon them by chance. The impossible positioning of the U.S. fleet, the timing of the interception, and the surgical precision of the American response all pointed to a single, devastating conclusion. The code, the invisible shield of the empire, had been shattered. The significance of this failure would haunt the Japanese leadership for the remainder of the war. They had built their strategy on the assumption of superior spirit and naval tradition, but they had been defeated by the quiet labor of mathematicians and linguists in a basement in Hawaii. The victory at Midway was not merely a triumph of pilots and gunners, but a testament to the power of information. It proved that in modern warfare, The most lethal weapon is not the caliber of the gun or the speed of the plane, but the clarity of the truth. The legacy of June 4 remains a poignant reminder of the fragility of power when it is built on the shifting sands of arrogance. The admirals who had sailed into the Central Pacific, expecting a final victory, instead found a graveyard, both for their ships and for their illusions of invincibility. The silence of the Pacific that evening was a heavy one, carrying the weight of thousands of lives lost to a battle that was decided before the first shot was even fired. It teaches us that the greatest tragedies of history often stem from the failure to see the world as it truly is, rather than how we wish it to be. In the most enduring monuments to those who fought are not the wreckage on the ocean floor, but the realization that even the most formidable empires can be unmade by the quiet courage of those who seek the truth in the shadows. June 4, 1942, just north of the tiny Midway Atoll, the sun hung high over a fleet that believed itself invincible. For Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and the men of the Kido Butai, the morning had been a series of tactical frustrations, but their confidence remained unshaken. They had spent the early hours swatting away wave after wave of American torpedo bombers, watching the slow, lumbering devastators fall into the sea like wounded birds. By 10 a.m., the Japanese flight decks were a chaotic maze of activity that looked like a disaster waiting to happen. Ground crews worked with feverish intensity, swapping land attack bombs for torpedoes, and back again as orders changed with the shifting reports of the American fleet's location. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks, and high-octane gasoline fumes filled the humid air, creating a tinderbox of immense proportions. They were preparing for a decisive strike, a killing blow that they believed would wipe the American presence from the Central Pacific forever. But at 10:22 a.m., the sky above the Japanese fleet suddenly transformed into a screaming nightmare. High above the scattered clouds, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey and his squadron of dauntless dive bombers had found the gap they were looking for after nearly running out of fuel. There were no sirens to warn the Japanese sailors, only the sudden, terrifying roar of engines as the Americans tipped their noses down and hurtled toward the ocean. In those fateful 5 minutes, the history of the world shifted its axis. The Kaga was the first to feel the wrath of the heavens. 4 direct hits ripped through her flight deck, detonating the stacks of unrestrained munitions and fueled aircraft waiting to launch. The ship became a volcano of twisted steel and incinerated dreams. Moments later, the Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was struck. A single bomb from Lieutenant Commander Richard Best bypassed the defensive fire and plunged through the flight deck near the midship elevator. It exploded in the upper hangar, igniting a chain reaction of torpedoes and fuel lines. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. His proudest symbols of imperial power were being reduced to charred skeletons in the time it took to draw a few ragged breaths. By 10:30 a.m., the Soryu was also a mass of uncontrollable fire. Within a single span of 300 seconds, the core of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier strength, the most formidable naval force on the planet, had been shattered. As the survivors clung to wreckage or stared in stunned silence from the decks of escorting destroyers, a chilling question began to circulate among the high command. How had the Americans known exactly where to find them? It was not just a matter of being found. The Americans had arrived at the exact moment the Japanese were most vulnerable, as if they had been reading the mission logs in real time. The answer lay not in a stroke of divine luck or a random patrol, but in a damp windowless basement in Hawaii known as Station Hypo. While the Japanese admirals had obsessed over the Bushido spirit and the perfection of their maneuvers, American cryptanalysts, led by Joseph Rochefort, had been quietly dismantling the Japanese naval code, JN-25. By identifying the target code AF as Midway through a clever ruse involving a fake water shortage report, the Americans had set a trap that the Japanese walked into with their eyes wide shut. As the smoke from the burning carriers drifted across the Pacific, The realization of a total security breach began to dawn on the Japanese leadership. They had operated under the assumption that their secrets were impenetrable, a hubris that blinded them to the reality of modern industrial warfare. The realization was more than a tactical shock. It was a psychological collapse. They discovered that their enemies had been reading their minds, listening to their plans, and anticipating their every move for months. The invincible wall of their naval codes had been a window all along. The loss of the 4 carriers at Midway was a wound from which the Empire would never recover. It was the moment the tide turned. Not because of a lack of bravery on the part of the Japanese sailors, but because information had become the most lethal weapon on the battlefield. The legacy of Midway is a testament to the invisible war fought with paper and pencil, where the stroke of a cryptographer's pen could be more devastating than a 1,000-pound bomb. It serves as a reminder that in the theater of war, the most dangerous vulnerability is the one you do not know you have. The wreckage of the Kido Butai, resting in the silent depths of the Pacific, remains a haunting monument to the cost of complacency. It teaches us that while steel and fire win battles, it is the mastery of the truth that wins wars. The ocean eventually reclaimed the ships, but the lesson lured: once the veil of secrecy is torn, the invincible becomes fragile, and the path to ruin is paved with the words your enemy has already heard. June 4, 1942, at Midway Atoll, the vast silence of the Pacific was shattered by the roar of dauntless dive bombers. But the true killing blow had been struck weeks earlier in a windowless basement in Hawaii. While the physical battle reached its cresco around 10:25 a.m., the tactical outcome had already been dictated by the scratching of pencils and the rhythmic clatter of IBM punch cards. We often think of naval warfare as a contest of steel, oil, and iron will, yet Midway stands as the definitive proof that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is information. The Japanese admirals, men like Yamamoto and Nagumo, were masters of a traditional form of war, one defined by the range of a cannon and the speed of a carrier. They could not conceive that their secret communications, the very lifeblood of their strategic planning, had become an open book to their adversaries. This disconnect created a phantom reality where the Japanese believed they were the hunters, even as they sailed directly into a meticulously prepared trap. The shock that rippled through the Imperial Japanese Navy upon realizing their codes were compromised was not just a military setback, it was a psychological collapse. For the remainder of the war, a shadow of doubt hung over every transmission. The invisible victory of Station Hypo and the brilliant, eccentric mind of Joseph Rochefort changed the fundamental nature of national security forever. Before Midway, intelligence was often viewed by commanders as a secondary support role, a series of whispers that might or might not be true. After the smoke cleared from the burning hulls of the Akagi and the Kaga, the world realized that signals intelligence was the high ground of the modern era. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare, where the mathematician was as vital as the admiral, and the linguist as dangerous as the pilot. This legacy endured long after the guns fell silent and the empires of the mid-century crumbled. The success at Midway laid the foundational philosophy for the modern intelligence state, leading directly to the creation of massive surveillance infrastructures and the global focus on cybersecurity we see today. The lesson learned in the Central Pacific was a brutal one. In a world of interconnected systems, the greatest vulnerability is not a lack of armor, but a lack of anonymity. We live today in the shadow of that discovery, in an age where metadata and encrypted packets are the front lines of global stability. National security is no longer just about guarding borders. It is about guarding the integrity of the signal. When we reflect on the wreckage resting 4 miles beneath the waves of the Pacific, we should see more than just the remains of a fleet. We should see the cost of a misplaced confidence in secrecy. The Japanese admirals were not defeated by a lack of courage or a lack of ships. They were defeated by a failure to understand that their enemy was listening to their very thoughts. The tragedy of Midway for the Japanese was the realization that they had been fighting a ghost, an opponent who knew their moves before they had even decided to make them. It serves as a haunting reminder that power is fragile, and that the most sophisticated technology can be rendered useless by a single broken cipher. The story of the cracked codes at Midway is a testament to the human element of war. The tireless, often unrecognized individuals who work in the dark so that others may fight in the light. It reminds us that while the brave may win the day, the wise win the future. As we look toward the conflicts of the future, the ghost of Midway remains a sentinel, warning us that the most devastating strikes are often those we never see coming, delivered not by fire, but by the quiet revelation of a secret we thought we had kept. The ocean has a way of swallowing the greatest machines of man, but it cannot drown the truth that was pulled from the air in 1942. The ultimate legacy of that invisible victory is the understanding that in the theater of human conflict, to be known is to be defeated, and the final word is always written by the one who is listening.